All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining in today and for inviting me to be part of the seminar. Today I'll be sharing some recent work that I've been doing with the Rios Vivos Andinos network on classifying natural flow regimes of the Amazon River Basin and some potential applications of this work. So this project was motivated by wanting to disentangle the many complex eco-hydrological relationships that exist across the Amazon and Andes regions. So I included the map here on the right that shows 9 of the major rivers of the Amazon flowing across a wide elevational gradient between 0 and 6,000 meters above sea level. And with this elevational gradient, we see a large range of climate, topography, and geology that form these unique and interconnected systems. Some examples of these connections include material transport of sediment and nutrients, productivity, species dispersal of insects and fish migrations, which are just a few of the processes that have a tremendous impact on habitat availability, forest productivity, and ecosystem structure all across the basin. And many of these processes have adapted to a natural flow regime. So a natural flow regime can be characterized from a hydrologic perspective from 5 main components, which are magnitude, duration, timing, frequency, and rate of change. So this diagram on the right shows how from a hydrograph from our data that we can extract some of these natural flow components, and then the figure on the right shows their direct connections to ecohydrology. Some of these being the influence of channel formation on biodiversity, the stability of base flows on life history patterns and linkages to lateral and longitudinal river connectivity, as well as maintenance of how maintenance of a natural flow regime can discourage invasion by non-native species. So over the past century, efforts to monitor streamflow have led to a strong spatial coverage of long-term streamflow data across the majority of Amazon nations. And this provides a ripe opportunity for inductive hydrologic classification, which can be useful for simplifying complex spatiotemporal variability in such a large and complex basin, characterizing that river variability and seeing what's diverse about it, exploring ecological relationships, prioritizing conservation efforts, and then transferring that knowledge to data-scarce regions. We define classification here as the systematic arrangement of rivers into groups with similar flow characteristics. And then recently, global classifications have emerged. One example being this global rivers classification from Hydrosheds, which characterizes rivers based on hydrology, climate, and geomorphic factors. Though to our knowledge, no Amazon-specific streamflow classification exists, and by doing so, we can contribute to our understanding of natural flow regimes and flow ecology relationships in this basin. So in this context, our goal was to use observed streamflow data to generate a flow classification for the Amazon basin that characterizes patterns of variation in streamflow. And our first step in achieving this goal was the processing of the streamflow data from these 5 countries listed in this table. The table also shows some of the processing steps that we used and the resulting number of stations that came out at each step, leaving us with 404 rivers to be able to classify. And then in this map here, we show our final stations included in the analysis, the gray that were removed because they did not meet some of the criteria that we've used, and then operational dams in yellow that were used to remove some potentially dam altered data to make sure that we're keeping to the natural flow regimes. And then after cleaning the streamflow time series, we created 2 data sets to study, one being flow metrics from the indicators of hydrologic alteration, and then another being median annualized hydrographs, which were discussed a little bit earlier. So the flow metrics, they comprise 33 indicators of hydrologic alteration that connect to those magnitude, duration, timing, rate of change, and the median annualized hydrographs simplify long-term time series by selecting the median discharge by day of year for each station. And then acknowledging the large influence of magnitude across the basin, we created parallel basin-specific datasets by excluding magnitude parameters or normalizing our hydrographs, leading to the formation of 4 total datasets. Then once we had our data, we used hierarchical clustering to divide rivers into groups based on their variance, with increasingly similar groups linked more immediately than more different groups, as shown in this dendrogram in the bottom right. We selected the number of classes for our classification using this metric called the gap statistic, which calculates the variance at each separation of the dendrogram and chooses the optimal number of classes where there is no longer a large reduction in variation, showing that it's been able to parsimoniously separate the classes into a number of groups that make sense mathematically. The gap statistic values are shown for each of our data sets, converging to 6 classes IHA magnitude independent, and then 7 when we did our normalized hydrographs. And then in our magnitude inclusive approaches, there was no convergence because of the large range of magnitude. So we also chose to separate these into 6 classes to maintain a parallel analysis. And then in interpreting our analyses, we wanted to show 2 types of figures, one being this map that showed the spatial distribution of classes by color and code, this being an example of how it would look, as well as the hydrographs that were used in one classification, but here are just for visualization, and their normalized counterparts, so that for all 4 of our class methods, we can see exactly what kind of rivers were there, what did they look like, and what's different about them. We also computed the class stability and normalized cross-correlation to see how close the rivers in these groups were to each other. And so starting off with our first classification, IHA all parameter, this approach, so we see that I'll just highlight a few of the salient features that come out of these classes. So with class 1 and 2, we see both of them have relatively lower flow magnitudes, and class 1 has a wet season peak in June, while class 2 has one in April, indicating a difference in seasonal timing. And class 1 stations are concentrated in the highest elevation regions of the Colombian and Ecuadorian Amazon. And as a result, because of their geography, are associated with these flashy peaks and hydrographs that contain a very high number of reversals between rising flow and falling flow. Then class 2, we have a relatively large and heterogeneous class with the lowest cross-correlation strength and stability values in this method. Class 3 are generally distributed across the Bolivian and Peruvian Amazon. Class 4, we have the highest number of classes in this group. We also see that they're widely distributed. Then class 5, as we increase in magnitude, we see that it has a distinct periodicity in its hydrograph. And then with class 6, we have the largest average flow magnitudes, and that these are located along the main stem of the river. And relative to other classes, these are characterized by high rise rates, low number of reversals between rising and falling days, and then a mid-annual wet season, corresponding to flow maxima in June. Then when we remove the influence of magnitude, we get a slightly different picture of what the flow classification looks like. Although one similarity did emerge, our class 1 stations tend to stay exactly the same and capture those same flashy rivers in the Ecuadorian and Colombian Amazon. In contrast, though, we see that classes 3, 4, and 5 have relatively a similar order magnitude and have relatively high measures of correlation strength. Then class 3 specifically have higher rise rates and relatively flashy behavior, while class 4 has a relatively or a highly coherent temporal pattern, and a lot of these groups, rivers align with each other. Then class 6 retains still retains the largest main stem rivers and adds stations along the main stems of major tributaries such as the Madeira, Tapajós, and Solimões, whose lower flow magnitudes cause them to be separated in the IHA all analysis, yet their smooth behavior causes them to be retained in this classification. Then when we switch over to the hydrographs and using those in classifications, we see a parallel that existed when we used the IHA all parameter classification, which is this very quick gradient of transitioning from your very low magnitude stations all the way up to your few concentrated high magnitude stations. So we see classes 1 and 2 are distributed across the Amazon and represent a wide variety of flow regime characteristics, a range of rise rates and number of reversals. And this is as we expect because we see in this class that its separating power is directed towards our largest rivers. So then with those remaining flow classes, we see that they are characterized by having very high discharge, low elevation, and very high correlation strength and stability. meaning their likelihood to be in this class if sampled again. Among these three groups, what they do have that sets them apart is a difference in flood pulse timing being slightly different in class 4, a slightly higher number of reversals in class 5, and then class 6 having the highest rise rates overall. And then following a similar trend when normalizing these hydrographs, specifically if we can see this, these hydrographs here are the ones that go into this classification. It produces a classification that is less focused on magnitude and more focused on separating based on timing, rate of change, and frequency parameters. So just to touch on a few characteristics of our classes, classes 1 and 2 have the smallest average discharge and higher number of reversals. Classes 2 are located in Ecuador, northern Brazil, and class 1 is located in Peru, Bolivia, and the southern portion of the Brazilian Amazon. Classes 3 and 5 have an earlier season flood peak, while class 4 is later on in the year and a higher number of reversals. And then class 3 are located in a broad swath of the southern Amazon, partially overlapping with our class 5 stations. And as well, our classes 3 and 5 share a similar order of magnitude. And class 6 and 7 also share that similar magnitude, but class 6 has an earlier flood peak, the highest rise rates, and then a lower number of reversals. And then these stations are located in a tight cluster in the west central Amazon compared to class 7, which are stay our main stem rivers. And all classes in this method have very high stability and correlation strength, with the exception of class 1, which is most likely due to the unpredictable flashy behavior that occurs in these rivers. So now that I've walked through some major features of those classes, I just want to point out how each of those directly can connect to ecological function, starting with some examples for magnitude. So with these, they tend to acknowledge the fact that we have a large number of these low magnitude headwater streams that then are widely distributed and then initiate that delivery of sediment and nutrient loads across the basin. And then as we increase our magnitude and stream order and go towards this, we see that delivery of nutrients and materials all the way from those headwater streams to the main stem rivers. Then when we're thinking about duration, the magnitude inclusive approaches also are very good at covering this kind of dynamic. So our duration parameters, they refer to the degree of inundation experienced by a river over those multiple timescales, which connects to vegetative stress that might occur during wet or dry conditions. And for example, we see a slightly more pronounced wet season in our class 5 than class 6. And despite the degree of seasonality that occurs there, they still maintain these strong base flows year-round and facilitate these biologically productive ecosystems. Then with regarding frequency, so the frequency of high and low pulses is driving that exchange of materials and nutrients between the river and the floodplain, structuring the biotic relationships along the river. And we can see some examples of this coming out in the Ecuadorian and Colombian Amazons, such as those as rivers identified in the class 1 stations, which are highly influenced by precipitation and the frequency of precipitation events, and how they are characterized by relatively short and generally unpredictable flood pulses. Conversely, as we increase our stream order and go along to our larger magnitude classes, we see that streams along those main stem rivers, they aggregate the flood pulse signals from all incoming tributaries and minimize the influence of precipitation and flashiness on frequency, thus giving us more predictable interannual flood frequencies. Then looking at timing, so something that this classification differs from the global rivers one is that it includes the variation of timing, which across this scale we feel is important in characterizing some differences, and which I felt that the normalized hydrograph classification best illustrates those differences that we have here. So we can see in classes 2, 4, and 7, we have a more mid-annual flood season, And in classes 3, 5, and 6, it's more earlier in the year. And this directly connects to the fish migrations, riparian productivity, and spawning and migration. So interesting connection between the seasonal timing and then biotic relationships that exist there. Oh, let me change that. Yes. And then lastly, the rate of change parameters include how quickly our water levels are falling, rising, and fluctuating. So when visualized through the median annualized hydrographs, it becomes clear that the rate of change for a smaller upland stream is larger with respect to its average discharge, such as in classes 1 and 2 here, but then much smaller when seen as a fraction of the overall river discharge, as we can see in class 6. So we might have higher rise rates here, but they wouldn't be as easily seen in the hydrograph. It really depends on the perspective that you're looking at the river with. And then from an ecological perspective, this gradient of rise rates is essential in characterizing the diversity of hydrologic regimes from our range of flashier upland streams to smoother, more predictable floodplain rivers. And then finally, what we have kind of embedded this analysis in is the ELOHA framework that was developed by POF in 2010. So this follows 5 broad steps that are aimed at improving environmental flows and conservation management frameworks in aquatic systems. And those steps include establishing a hydrologic foundation and river classification, which we've done here, using our baseline hydrographs and flow metrics, and then producing a hydrologic classification that tends to incorporate a lot of the spatial landscape elements of our basin. Then this provides a framework for one to assess the influence of potential alteration from climate change, land use change, or dams, as David will talk about next. Then we can use this to contextualize it in flow ecology linkages, one of the major motivations behind this project, with the presence of ecological data that is available, establishing these flow ecology hypotheses and being able to test them, and then ultimately linking that to, once the flow ecology hypothesis is made, seeing what kind of severity and degree of alteration might change that and how. And then lastly, connecting it into this larger framework of societal processes directly linked to societal values and management programs, the implementation of conservation programs, and environmental flows and adaptive management programs. So in conclusion, the approach that we have here provides this framework and data-driven approach for classifying flow regimes based on observed data. The clustering that we use includes magnitude and magnitude-independent approaches and is intended explicitly to account for the influence of magnitude and driving flow regime classification, though also finding when you minimize that influence that you have other salient features that emerge across your rivers and across the basin. And applications of this work include relating flow metrics to ecological functions, especially those that may be hard to directly measure, where you can rely on consistently measured streamflow data, understanding trends and unique features of Amazon rivers, and then establishing a baseline for which one could assess future alteration of rivers. And then finally, this work was really deeply supported by many institutions and excellent faculty and students that were supportive in this process, and I wanted to thank them here. And that is all. So,
Great. Thank you very much, Shar. I think we will hold off on questions until the end. We do invite questions for all of our speakers after we are finished, but in the interest of time, we will move on to Dr. David Kaplan, who will follow up on this presentation and talk about effects of damming on hydrology.
Sounds good.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks a lot. Can you see my screen? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Shar, for that great introduction to the natural flow regime. I think my job will be easier now, having that great introduction. And so I'm going to talk about some work that I pursued with a former student, Kelsey Timpe, to look at where we have dams in the Amazon currently and where we have sufficient hydrologic data, how have those dams changed that hydrologic regime and varied away from that natural flow regime that Charmaine was telling us about. And so thanks also to the coordinators of the webinar, especially to Stephanie and Carol, Diana, Angelica. I really appreciate all the work that has gone into making such a great event despite the challenges of the times. So thanks a lot. Okay, so I think the motivation is probably clear to most of the folks on the call, but the idea that across the tropics and particularly in South America, there's been this push towards hydropower development, at least until the past few years, strongly in Brazil. And here I'll be using the term UHE for large dams, or Usina Hidroelétrica, and PCH for Pequenas Centrais Hidroelétricas. So, you know, these are, this document's a little old, but the idea from the Program for Accelerated Growth that dozens and dozens of dams being sort of planned and inventoried for the Brazilian Amazon. And of course, the work from Elizabeth Anderson and her co-authors to look, updating Feiner and Jenkins 2012, and finding in the Andean Amazon upwards of 300, maybe 160 existing and 140 planned dams in the Andean Amazon. And so we're motivated to understand how these existing systems, so today's systems, have been affecting the hydrologic regime with this cascade of effects on the biology, the ecology, and of course on social systems as well. So I guess sort of to long story short is that the rapid pace of this hydropower development, along with hydrovias, the spatial scale across the Amazon, and the potential for really irreversibly changing this globally important system, make this impending transformation unprecedented. And the work of colleagues in the Amazon Dams Network and Rios Vivos Andinos has really focused on trying to understand and prevent some of these impacts, or try to improve our process for mitigating the impacts of this type of development. So with that context, the talk I want to give today is really asking the question, what are the eco-hydrological effects of the existing dams across the Amazon? This map is from a publication in 2016 by Joanna Tucker Lima, showing at this time 28 large dams in the Amazon. And I want to say that all these data that we use to do this analysis are available on this, this database from a paper that Joanna wrote in 2016 with 15 co-authors, graduates, undergraduates, Brazilian, US institutions. And these data include not only data on flow and rainfall, but also health, economy, and other sort of social metrics of infrastructural change. So I do point you to this article, and go use that data to answer other questions about how things have been changing, at least in the Brazilian Amazon. And here we were limiting our analysis to the Brazilian legal Amazon just because of the data we had available at the time. So this question, what about eco-hydrology? What are the eco-hydrologic effects? I know we have a lot of people who might understand this term, and others that have coming from different disciplines. So when I talk about eco-hydrologic effects, we think about these two major ways that dams disrupt aquatic ecology. And the first way is longitudinal, or upstream to downstream disconnection. So this would be important for things like, of course, fish passage, sediment and nutrient transport. And then the other primary direction is this lateral connection between the river and its floodplain, so affecting nutrient cycling and geomorphology, each of these having an effect on potentially on the quantity and the quality of waters. And particularly when we think about the flow regime, here I'm showing a paper from Brian Richter back in 1996. This is a river in the American West, but showing that the hydrograph, or basically the flow graphed over time, in time periods before and after a dam. And you don't have to be a hydrologist to look at this figure and note that there are sort of attributes of the natural flow regime that are very different than the managed flow regime. So taken together, these loss of connectivity, both upstream, downstream, and from the river to its floodplain, lead to losses in biodiversity, habitat fragmentation, and on, even all the way to impacts on social and economic systems. So Char did a great job. I don't need to spend much time here, but saying that when we talk about the natural flow regime, we go back to Leroy-Poff in 1997 and say there's magnitude, how much water, timing, when does that water arrive, rate of change, so how quickly does the water raise or lower, how often do flood events occur, and the duration of those flood events, each affecting the connectivity, water, morphology, transport, and scaling through biology from invertebrates all the way to societies. So Char did a great job of that. And the goal here of looking at eco-hydrology is to connect attributes of this flow regime to the specifics of the life cycle of various fish. Here I show Coromata and Dorada just because they're two sort of commercially important and iconic fish for the Amazon basin. But really for any fish or any aquatic organism, the goal is to connect these attributes of the flow regime with the life cycle, the sort of adaptive and evolutionary life cycle of an organism. So we find that this example highlights successful reproduction for a particular species requires the natural flow regime elements from timing to rate of change, magnitude, duration, and frequency. So with that context, the goal for this research is to look for exactly how the hydrologic regime has been altered by dams in the Amazon. If possible, can we identify predictors of when and where that alteration is worse or better? So are there other predictors we might use to project future changes in future dam development? And then if they're present, can we find the cumulative effects of building multiple dams on rivers? So often their dams are built in cascade. And do we see any additional effects from that multiple dam approach? Okay, so the way we did that, see a little drawing there in the top. So I'm gonna clear that out. No, I don't know who drew on there. Okay, so the method that we used to do this was the IHA, or the Indicators of Hydrologic Alteration method. It was developed in the 1990s by the Nature Conservancy. And what it develops is 33 ecologically relevant flow parameters. These are derived from daily flow data. Those are in that Tucker-Lima paper, and they were all derived from the Agência Nacional do Água, the Brazilian water agency. And I'll say there's a lot, there's 33 parameters here, I'm not gonna go through them, but just to call back that picture of these 5 major elements of the flow regime. And within IHA, there are 5 groups that sort of correspond to these. So the magnitude of flows, extreme events, timing, pulses, and rate of change. And so when we summarize these results, we'll look at both the overall mean of all 33 of these, as well as within group means for each of these types of change to the hydrologic regime. And the way we do this very simply is we compare the regime before and after the dam was implemented and calculate a percentage change. So for any one of these metrics, we calculate before, after, and look at the percent difference. So I'm going to show just one very, hopefully very clear example before diving into some of the results here. But here is Balbina Dam and Reservoir, and it's kind of infamous in the environmental community. It's been described as the worst hydroelectric dam in the world. It's also been called an infamous environmental and technical disaster. And so it's an interesting dam to be able to include in our case and try to understand if that's the case. And what I have in these figures, these graphs, is on the top just flow over time in 3 periods: before the dam, during construction, and after the dam. And I have one of those 33 metrics. This is the high pulse count, and it's basically the number of times the flow gets above the 75th percentile of the flow. And we look at the pre and we look at the post, and probably even without doing this analysis, you can say, well, there's some sort of change in that hydrologic regime. And so the task for us is to look at these changes and see their significance and where dams have had the highest or largest impact on the hydrologic regime. So when I show the results, I'm going to show 2 basic sets. The first is for individual dams, and we were able to find data for 8 large dams, over 22 stations, and 4 smaller dams. Data for smaller dams, flow gauging stations are sort of less available. We were only able to find 4 small dams over 5 stations. And then I'll also show some results for multiple dams, but I'll come back to that. And I'm going to use Balbina and Serra da Mesa as sort of an exemplar of 2 ways in which dams can change the hydrologic regime. Sort of 2 just sort of case studies as we review all of the total 12 dams that we were able to look at. So the first thing is, let's just look at the hydrographs for these two stations downstream of these 2 dams. So Balbina on the Rio Guatemala on the top and Serra da Mesa on the Tocantins. And each one of these figures is just showing flow over time before and after the dam. So before and after Serra da Mesa, after Serra da Mesa. And these are useful for comparison. They have very similar median or mean fluxes or flows, 600, 700, 800, but they have very different hydrographs. And we can begin to see how dams affect each of these rivers in a very different way. So stepping through here on the left remain those 2 hydrographs that I showed you before. And here's one example from group 1, these monthly magnitudes. And here's the median flow in October. And this happens to be the dry season in these regions. And we see that in Balbina, the mean flow before after the dam increases by 100% or more or less doubles. And the same is the case for Ceja de Mesa. And we see this in a lot of dam systems where the dry season flows are augmented with releases through the dam. And it's just one of the 12 months that go into the group 1 magnitude. So how is the magnitude change? Well, in the dry season, the magnitude has about doubled, with it really important for aquatic organisms and, for example, germination of floodplain species. Jumping to group 2, here's the annual maximum flow. You can squint at this graph of Balbina and see actually the peaks in each of these years before and after the dam are not so different. And that comes out in our analysis of the annual maximum flows, fairly unchanged at Balbina. Take your attention down to Ceja de Mesa, where all the peak flows have been chopped off, and we see a strong decline, 71% decline in maximum flow. And then for minimum flow, we have a result that mirrors what we saw for October, but not much change at Ceja de Mesa for the minimum flow. These small flows still escaping through dam releases across seasons. Looking at groups 4 and 5, here's that high pulse count that I showed you before, a huge increase at Balbina, basically a much flashier system with dam operation, doing hydropeaking operations there, not as much of a change at Ceja de Mesa. And then this number of reversals. So this is the idea of how many times the flow goes from up to down over the course of a year, increasing, tripling at Balbina and going up by 2/3 at Ceja de Mesa. So this is indicative, of course, of hydropower operations, but also very confusing as, for example, a queue of fish spawning or migration. Okay, so these are just a few examples I could show for each of our stations for all 33 parameters, but we'd be here all day. So I want to just summarize for Balbina and Ceja de Mesa. How do we think about, maybe it's not the most sort of scientific way to say it, but how badly has the dam affected the flow regime? And we can say across all 33 parameters, Balbina was about twice as bad as Ceja de Mesa. We can also look at it across these 5 metrics of the flow regime from group 1 to 5. And a couple things to point out is that these groups 4 and 5 about the frequency and duration of pulsed events, sort of the number of reversals and the rate of change, often come out to be the most impacted, at least in the Amazon. We see across the Amazon, these are some of the highest impacts. Okay, so that's just for 2 of our dams, and I want to step through these results across all 12 dams across 27 stations. And to do that, I have a graph here with the mean hydrologic alteration on the y-axis. Each one of these bars represents a station. If the bar has the same color, that station is associated with a dam. So for example, all these blue ones are Tucururi. The U indicates upstream, or Amontanchi. The D is downstream, Ajusanchi. And then there's a little map over here showing where these dams are. Okay, so what are some things that pop out from our analysis? The first is that Balbina does indeed come out as the worst hydroelectric dam, maybe not in the world, but certainly in Brazil. It ranks highest as far as hydrologic alteration. We can also look at stations upstream and downstream of a particular dam. So here's Tucururi with a higher impact downstream than other stations that are upstream. So we'll think about that in a few moments. We can look at these unfilled bars are all small dams or PCHs. And while they are relatively low in hydrologic alteration, they certainly are not at the tail end of this distribution. And so these are some of the things that we can get by assessing hydrologic alteration across a wide range of dam settings and hydrogeographic settings. The other thing we can do is take these same data and look how it varies by group. So the mean in the bar is just here shown as the mean within group hydrologic alteration. And I just want to make the case here that these red and blue lines, again, groups 4 and 5, are often the most impacted attributes of the flow regime across many, many of our dam systems. So the next thing we did is we took all the results in the top figure and we scaled it, or we dimensioned it by the published electricity production potential of each of the dams to see basically, well, perhaps Balbina has a lot of impact on the flow regime, but how does it look compared to its electricity generation potential? So when we do that, a few things pop out. Manso Dam and Balbina about equilibrate, but perhaps more important than that, I'll note the log scale on the y-axis is all these small dams with relatively low alteration of the hydro regime, when scaled by their production capacity, are an order of magnitude sometimes higher than their sort of compatriot large dams. And so we see that as a potential place to focus future attention. Oh, so those are the PCHs. Okay. So very quickly looking at how rivers with multiple dams are affected. We had 3 basins and a total of 7 rivers. I'm just going to focus on the Tocantins, which has 7 dams, at least currently 7 dams. And the way that we did this is the flow gauge downstream of Tucuri. And we have a long flow record, and we had to break it up into periods sort of different dam development. And the way we did that was first looking at the pre-impact period. So this is all the data before Tucuri was closed and went online. We have information just basically after Tucuri and all the way through the next dam. So that would be one dam. We also developed basically a data set that included Tucuri and Ceja de Mesa, way upstream in the watershed, and then a post-impact period too that included the additional 5 dams. And so there's a lot of ways to parse this. There's a lot of stations that come off and online, but these are some of the most sort of useful for comparing cumulative effects. So I have here again the mean hydrologic alteration across the different groups, and I have the different gray bars as with 1 dam, with 2 dams, and with 7 dams. Now some of these stations, some of these dams are upstream, some are downstream. In this case, Tucuri is the most downstream station, so each dam that comes online is an added sort of upstream change in the water delivery. So what do we see? We see in general this increase in the hydrologic alteration with time as these dams come online, with this exception of group 4, which we still haven't quite figured out why things sort of equilibrate in group 4. And then moving into the middle of the watershed, this is in Pesci. So when Ceja de Mesa and Canabrava are on versus when all 5 dams that are relevant to this gauging station. And again, we see this increase in hydrologic alteration. So cumulative effects occurring. So a few points of discussion. I know it's a lot of information. I think at the core, each dam is different. We saw Balbina and Ceja de Mesa acting very differently in the way that the dams affected their flows. But despite these differences, we see a few things that are across the board. And some insights that we can draw, hopefully for guiding future dam development or mitigation plans, reoperation plans for existing dams. The first one is about the types of impacts. So we see here a diversity of impacts, but certainly groups 4 and 5 being higher. We see that downstream effects are in general across all types of hydrologic regime change. Downstream effects are higher. And we often focus on the reservoir, displacement in the reservoir, changes in limnology in the reservoir, and mitigation upstream, but we see much larger effects downstream. We see these groups 4 and 5 that are really critical to the attributes of the flood pulse. So for fish recruitment, for the availability of floodplain habitat, particularly in group 4. And in group 5, this cues for fish reproduction, for stranding organisms in floodplain lakes if those changes are too frequent, and for reducing floodplain germination of the plant community. This question of large versus small, where we have these basically bang for the buck for these PCHs is relatively small because their production is low. And we see this as a problem. Of course, I think we have on the line here Julian Olden and Tiago Couto writing about how PCHs, or these small dams, are really where the future of dam development and even the recent past has been in Brazil. And this slide I took from Angela Lavino from the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, or the Brazilian Energy Planning Agency, showing that their decadal energy plan for 2029 does have 10 large dams, 50 small dams. And so of these 10, only 7 are indicated and 3 are in the Amazon, but sort of a preponderance of small dams coming in the future. Also wanted to know if there was something that we could use to predict how badly the hydrologic regime was impacted. And what I'm showing here is basically for a number of variables, physical, geographic variables about the reservoir, about the flow regime, about the elevation or the distance of the station from the dam. Are there correlations between hydrologic alteration, positive correlations shown in blue, negative correlations shown in red, and anywhere that is boxed is a significant relationship? And so just to say, if we're looking downstream, we can use elevation as a predictor, a very strong predictor of overall hydrologic alteration. So to put it bluntly, lowland dams with large reservoirs should be avoided. And I think we know that for a lot of other reasons, both social and ecological, but here coming out very strongly from hydrologic alteration. When we look upstream, we also see elevation, and even more so the area of the reservoir as being a very strong and significant predictor. So this allows us to sort of think about future dams and where they are, and even without knowing about the type of design or operating rules, we can get a guess for how impactful these systems will be on the hydrologic regime. So I think that that's useful for application to future dams. And then this question of individual versus multiple dams. I showed a few examples on Tocantins, but overall, rivers with individual dams versus rivers with multiple dams, there are small increases in the overall hydrologic alteration. They are only significant for these higher order impacts. So this is these rate of change and these sort of frequency of flood pulse events, which we do see an impact of multiple dams. So the take-home message is that the type and magnitude of changes varies a lot, but certain elements are sort of more impacted, and these would be groups 4 and 5. You can interrupt the aquatic ecology without changing maximum or annual flows very strongly. And we also saw that the impacts were highest downstream, but for example, mitigation programs often ignore downstream communities. So this is a problem if you're a fisherman relying on the downstream hydrologic pulse. Secondly, we saw that small dams have large impacts in relation to their electricity production potential. And so the guidance here that licensing for PCHs, the small dams should be rigorous and consider the trade-offs between, at a basin scale between ecology and energy production, work like Rafael has been doing recently. We see some strong predictions of alteration of the hydrologic regime. So lowland dams, large reservoirs clearly should be avoided whenever possible. Another thing I didn't mention is that we would expect that distance, so how far away you are from the dam, should be a strong predictor of a reduced hydrologic alteration. We see that these effects are clear 100 to 200 kilometers, particularly downstream of a dam. So there are very distant effects that need to be considered and mitigated. And finally, that cumulative effects were apparent. And so again, strategic planning at the watershed scale for licensing, mitigation, and even just for the modeling we're attempting to do is really strongly necessary. With that, I thank everyone and acknowledge the Amazon Dams Network for all the assistance and all the collegiality and collaboration over the past 5 years or so. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, David. I'll mention to folks just joining us now that we're going to hold off on questions until our last speaker has gone. And Shar and David have talked about hydrology and impacts over the whole Amazon basin. Our next speaker, Dr. Rafael Almeida, will talk about impacts in one very important river and connections to biology and people. So go ahead, Rafael.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and thanks, David and Char, for these great talks. I think they set up the stage nicely now for talking specifically about one dam. So what I want to show is quite related to what both of you showed. I will do this a bit. I'll share my screen, and then I'll do this a bit differently from you. So I have my slides in English, but then I'll switch to Portuguese. Bom, mudando agora então de idioma. É prazer apresentar um pouco do meu trabalho para vocês hoje. Meu nome é Rafael, eu sou liminólogo de formação. Eu hoje sou pós-doc aqui em Cornell, nos Estados Unidos. Trabalho com o Alex Flecker, que é um ecólogo, e a professora Carla Gomes, que trabalha com ciência da computação. E a gente tem trabalhado em projetos olhando para efeitos cumulativos de hidrelétricas na Amazônia e o papel do planejamento estratégico para minimizar impactos no futuro. Só que hoje o que eu quero trazer aqui para vocês está relacionado a principalmente coisa que eu fiz durante meu mestrado e meu doutorado na Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora. Meu orientador foi o professor Fábio Roland. E eu trabalhei bastante com as hidrelétricas do Madeira, particularmente Santo Antônio. E antes de começar, eu quero agradecer aqui e reconhecer o papel dos principais coautores e colaboradores nesse trabalho que eu vou apresentar especificamente aqui hoje. Então, é o resultado de muitas mãos, os dados que eu vou apresentar para vocês. E o que eu quero mostrar são especificamente alguns efeitos hidrológicos no Rio Madeira, a jusante de Giral e Santo Antônio, que são duas das maiores usinas a fio d'água do mundo e foram recentemente construídas. Quando eu digo que elas operam a fio d'água, O que eu quero dizer é que a quantidade de água que entra é aproximadamente igual à quantidade de água que sai. A capacidade de armazenamento de uma usina igual a de Santo Antônio, de regulação da água, ela é pequena comparada à capacidade de regulação, por exemplo, de Samuel, que está do lado de Santo Antônio, mas está num rio diferente, que é o Rio Jamari. E aí, quando a gente compara uma usina de armazenamento com um fio d'água, a gente vê uma diferença bem clara. No caso de Santo Antônio aqui, o que entra se sobrepõe com o que sai, o pulso de inundação sazonal é mantido. Em Samuel, a gente tem uma maior regulação da água, a gente vê uma supressão dos pulsos, né? Tanto das cheias quanto das secas, e o hidrograma fica mais achatado. Voltando agora para Santo Antônio e Giral, elas estão localizadas na altura de Porto Velho, no estado de Rondônia, ficam cerca de 1.000 quilômetros a montante da confluência do Rio Madeira com o Rio Amazonas. Nessa apresentação aqui hoje, os dados que eu vou mostrar são essencialmente dados de vazão e nível da água que estão disponíveis no site da Agência Nacional de Águas. As estações que eu uso aqui são essencialmente a Bunã, que fica montante das duas barragens e serve como controle, Porto Velho, que fica imediatamente abaixo das duas barragens, e o Maitá, que também está abaixo, mas está a 250 quilômetros aproximadamente de Porto Velho. E uma coisa que eu queria mencionar, só para quem não tem uma dimensão do tamanho do rio, quando eu vou falar do Rio Madeira para o pessoal aqui nos Estados Unidos, eu gosto de comparar ele com o Mississippi, que é o maior rio que eles têm aqui. E a vazão do Rio Madeira aqui em Porto Velho, ela é equivalente, a vazão média do Rio Madeira em Porto Velho é equivalente à vazão média do Mississippi na foz dele. Então, acho que muita gente já está familiarizado com a Amazônia e sabe o tamanho do Rio Madeira, mas só queria reforçar isso para quem não tem tanta familiaridade com esse rio. Então, a pergunta central aqui é se essas hidrelétricas afetaram a hidrologia jusante. Esse gráfico aqui mostra o regime hidrológico do Rio Madeira, em Porto Velho, sob condições naturais. A gente tem as cheias e vazantes bem definidas e previsíveis. Temos um período aqui de águas altas em março e abril, aí a gente vê a vazão descendo, chega no águas baixas, agosto, setembro, outubro. Então, a água sobe e a gente inicia o ciclo. Esse é o padrão, o regime hidrológico natural do Rio Madeira. E as espécies e as populações humanas que usam o rio, elas estão historicamente adaptadas a esse padrão natural. Um exemplo aqui, na cheia, o alagamento das florestas alagáveis, ela fornece alimento para organismos aquáticos, como peixes, que são importantes dispersores de sementes, por exemplo. E tem também importância comercial e cultural para o rio. Quando a gente tem as águas baixas, a gente tem exposição dos bancos de areia, que são locais de reprodução para tartaruga, para pássaros, enfim. Toda a biota e também as pessoas que vivem no rio, elas são adaptadas no timing, em diversos aspectos. E, na verdade, a gente não vê esse tipo de coisa acontecendo quando a gente olha a hidrógrafa do Rio Madeira comparando pré e pós-barramento. E isso era esperado, estava nas previsões de impacto. Então, a gente sabe que o que entra deve ser igual ao que sai, e é por isso que quando a gente faz esse tipo de comparação, a gente não vê nenhum tipo... Aqui é bem grosseira, nós estamos só olhando o hidrograma, mas a gente não vê nenhum tipo de alteração que salta os olhos. E eu não vou apresentar os dados especificamente disso, mas se você for olhar aqueles componentes do regime hidrológico natural que a Char e o David mostraram, magnitude, duração, frequência, timing, eles foram mantidos após a construção das usinas. Mas tem uma coisa
que acontece ali no Rio Madeira é quando a gente olha para o ritmo da mudança, para a velocidade de mudança. Esse sim é um componente do regime hidrológico que sofreu mudança, e é o que eu vou mostrar para vocês agora. Isso só fica claro quando a gente dá um zoom no hidrograma. Aqui eu vou dar um zoom nas águas baixas de 2010, antes do barramento, e nas águas baixas de 2016, depois do barramento, para dar um exemplo para vocês. Quando a gente faz isso, a gente nota um indício forte de alteração hidrológica. Vejam como que a mudança na vazão, ao longo do tempo, ela fica muito mais errática. Você tem um ruído muito mais acentuado. Isso é o que a população local chama de repiquete. Quando a gente compara os períodos de pré e pós-barramento, a gente nota que nos dias em que a vazão está aumentando, ela aumenta numa velocidade maior. Nos dias em que ela está caindo, ela também diminui numa velocidade maior. É isso que esse gráfico está mostrando aqui para a gente, comparando pré e pós. Ou seja, os aumentos e as diminuições na vazão entre um dia e o outro são, em média, mais abruptos agora do que eles eram antes de barrar. Outra coisa que a gente observou foi um aumento no número de reversões na vazão. As reversões são mudanças de um período em que a vazão está subindo para um período em que a vazão está caindo. Vou dar um exemplo aqui, hipotético para 10 dias e 10 vazões hipotéticas. Suponha que no primeiro dia você tem uma vazão de 300, no segundo ela sobe para 320, no terceiro 340, e aí no quarto ela cai para 330. Aqui você teve um evento de reversão. No quinto ela desce para 320, continua descendo, mas no sexto ela volta a subir. Tem outro evento de reversão. No sétimo dia ela continua subindo, mas no oitavo ela volta a cair. Tem um outro evento de reversão aqui. E assim sucessivamente. Nesse exemplo aqui, a gente tem, então, 3 eventos de reversões com base na série diária de vazões. O que acontece é que quando a gente compara o período de pré-barramento com o período de pós-barramento, em Porto Velho, a gente vê que o número de reversões quase triplicou no Rio Madeira. Então, esse parece ser um efeito significativo das usinas. Mas um jeito da gente confirmar se de fato é um efeito da usina é comparar com extração controle. Será que isso está acontecendo em Abunã, que está acima dos reservatórios? Foi isso que a gente fez. A gente comparou aqui a taxa de aumento, a taxa de diminuição, o número de reversões, e em Abunã, que está aqui na esquerda, não há diferença entre pré e pós-barramento. Outra coisa que a gente fez foi olhar como que essas diferenças elas se propagam até o Maitá. Quanto tempo demora para isso se dissipar? Quando a gente olha para os dados de um Maitá, a gente vê que há uma boa atenuação desse efeito que é observado em Porto Velho. Esses gráficos que eu mostrei aqui agora são de variação de curto prazo, de um dia para o outro. Mas a gente olhou também se existe um efeito maior na variação subdiária, entre uma hora e outra. Esse gráfico aqui, ele mostra a variação mediana do nível da água entre uma hora e outra do dia, com base em dados de 2015 a 2018, para Abunã, a nossa estação controle, e Porto Velho. Em condições naturais, a gente não espera nenhum tipo de padrão horário na variação do nível da água no rio. E o fato é que isso está acontecendo aqui em Abunã, tá vendo? A linha está estabilizada em 0, a gente não vê um efeito positivo da hora do dia na variação do nível da água. Só que em Porto Velho tem um padrão diário bem característico que sugere que o reservatório, em geral, segura a água tarde da noite e de manhã para liberar durante o dia. Ou seja, ele segura a água, a gente tem uma diminuição no nível da água e durante a noite e durante o dia, quando as pessoas estão dormindo, e durante o período em que as pessoas estão trabalhando e consumindo mais energia, a água, a jusante, ela tende a aumentar o nível da água. Esse é um padrão horário que a gente conseguiu detectar. E isso está muito provavelmente associado à operação da usina, né, para atender as demandas de energia, que a gente plotou aqui para o mesmo período a mediana da variação horária do nível da água em Porto Velho. Em cima, né, a gente tem, e embaixo a gente tem a mediana da demanda de energia do subsistema norte do Sistema Interligado Nacional. E essa variação do nível da água em Porto Velho, ela acompanha a variação da demanda do subsistema. Então, tem duas mensagens principais aqui dessa análise dos efeitos hidrológicos. Uma é que o pulso de inundação, a sazonalidade do pulso de inundação, as características mais de longo prazo, de longo termo, elas não foram afetadas. Já no curto prazo, há efeitos que a gente consegue detectar no regime hidrológico. A habilidade da vazão e dos níveis da água, tanto entre dias como entre horas. Para finalizar agora, eu quero só... Aqui a gente... isso é um artigo, um manuscrito que a gente está agora trabalhando na revisão dele, que já foi submetido, e os nossos dados, eles são estritamente uma análise do efeito hidrológico. Os dados que a gente tem não permitem nenhuma aferição quantitativa das consequências ambientais e sociais desses repiquetes. Mas eu queria até trazer para a discussão, a gente pode conversar depois aqui, eu sei que tem muita gente que vem trabalhando com isso, inclusive a Carolina Dória, que é coautora nesse trabalho, é que quando a gente cruza esse tipo de informação que a gente obtém a partir dos dados da ANA, com o conhecimento tradicional dos ribeirinhos, há indicativo de que esses repiquetes, eles não têm, os efeitos dele não são negligenciáveis. A Carolina conversa bastante, trabalha bastante com os pescadores, a jusante, e eles relatam que a barragem aumentou o número de repiquetes e que ela causa afundamento de embarcação, os repiquetes, né, causam afundamento de embarcação, e eles argumentam também que as mudanças repentinas de nível da água, elas afetam os sinais para a reprodução dos peixes e afetam a pesca. Isso são relatos dos pescadores em relação aos repiquetes. E outra coisa interessante que aconteceu também foi recente, um artigo publicado, liderado pelo Rangel Santos, mostrou que a percepção dos pescadores sobre os impactos das barragens no Madeira. E o que eles encontraram é que 75% dos pescadores a jusante da barragem, que participaram desse estudo, eles indicam que a irregularidade do regime hidrológico é o principal impacto no rio. Quando eles se referem à irregularidade aqui, eles estão se referindo ao repiquete. Eu achei interessante porque os autores eles transcreveram alguns comentários dos pescadores sobre esse impacto no rio. E eles dizem coisa como que nos velhos tempos o rio era mais previsível, mas agora eles não sabem quando o rio vai descer ou subir. E que esses repiquetes, de fato, atrapalham a pesca. E a pesca, ela é talvez o impacto mais importante descrito, o efeito na pesca, a diminuição da quantidade de pescado talvez o impacto mais importante descrito para essas usinas até agora. Diferentes estudos já mostraram que houve uma diminuição na quantidade de peixe que é pescado, e acho que não, para finalizar aqui, eu acho que não há nossos dados não permitem associar o repiquete, a ocorrência do repiquete, à diminuição na pesca, porque tem diversos outros fatores ligados à construção de uma barragem que afetam a pesca. Mas eu acho que esse é um tópico que merece aprofundamento dos estudos, e a gente agora tem um trabalho em revisão, a gente pretende divulgar ele em breve, e para contribuir para essa discussão ali específica para o Rio Madeira, mas que tem implicações também para outras grandes usinas a fio d'água que têm sido construídas ou que podem ser construídas na Amazônia. Bom, só para finalizar, acho que a gente, repetindo o que eu acabei de dizer, basicamente, a gente consegue reconhecer a ocorrência de efeitos hidrológicos ali, que são essas mudanças de curto prazo, e a gente precisa ver se agora, se é importante entender se isso vai se traduzir em impactos sociais e ecológicos também, se isso consegue explicar os impactos observados. E aí sim, dá para se propor estratégias de mitigação e controle desse impacto. Mas, para concluir, o repiquete ele pode ser um efeito hidrológico importante de grandes hidrelétricas a fio d'água na Amazônia. Eu agradeço pela atenção. Vou deixar meu e-mail aqui, quem quiser fique à vontade para contactar, e agora fico à disposição também para a gente conversar mais.
Yes, thank you so much to Rafael. Yes, so I want to again thank our speakers and our participants.
Novamente agradecendo a todos os palestrantes por compartilhar conosco seus resultados, e agradecer a todos que estiveram aqui presentes. Muito obrigada, foi um prazer enorme ter vocês aqui. Em breve teremos mais alguns webinários e também novidades sobre o nosso workshop que a gente pretende fazer online, e logo a gente vai estar divulgando para vocês. Ok? Um abraço grande a todos e se cuidem. Fiquem em casa.